This is Ace from Delta 2 Alpha, and this is the Monks and Mavericks podcast. Today we're getting away from the usual fighting and smashing people side of things in performance, and we're going down a little bit of a garden path. I got the brother Hoodoo Moses with me, um, and we're just gonna let him introduce himself. Be in for a good one. Bring an open mind, brother. You there?
I am here, sir. What's going on?
Living the dream, as we say.
That's every day. That's every day. We find ourselves in these times where I'm like, my life finally makes complete sense. My trajectory through life is finally just totally. Before I was kind of like, how could this have happened to me? How could this be what I did with my life? It's never gonna fit. But now, oh man, these are the times I was meant to thrive in.
Yeah, living the dream is interesting. Sometimes it's the one where the clowns are trying to kill you, but it's still the dream.
Yeah, more just being awake though.
Exactly. So for those of you that sit at home that don't know, Brother Hoodoo Moses is the resident occult specialist and juju, voodoo, unting. And actually is a conjuring man full time now. So we're going to go down the garden path with him on this. I've been looking forward to this one for a minute. Moses, how do we get here?
Phew. Well, you mean us as a society or us as you and me? Because I got answers to both of those.
I was gonna be more what's the origin story? Right?
Sure.
Like how was you
Origin
wound
story.
up being the weird dude
Yeah.
doing weird black magic stuff?
Yeah. There's been layers and layers, right? Like it again, it's the sort of thing where in retrospect you're like, oh, naturally my whole life was leading to this. But as it was happening, none of it really made any sense. Um, I was raised in a pretty religious Jewish family, but my dad is from Iran. So Iranian Judaism is like a weird, it's separated from the main body of Judaism and developed its own way from the older rites a long time ago. So it's very superstitious, what people might call it, practice. There's all sorts
Is
of
that the
charms.
Ashkenazis?
No, not Ashkenazi at all. It's technically Sephardi, but
Okay.
it's separate. It's not like most of the other Sephardic Jews at least went through Spain at some point, whereas the Persian Jews kind of established themselves right, as soon as there was an exile, it said that, who knows if it's true, at least two tribes, or the tribe of Ephraim and part of another tribe, settled in Persia and have been there for, thousands of years. As far as we can trace our family story back, that's the story we got. So there's a lot of like, um, I don't know, like again, belief in the evil eye, belief in curses, and things of that nature was very prominent. My dad called it superstition, but I was exposed to it and sort of just took it for granted. Around the time I was, I guess, 12 or 13 years old, by then I was already, well, so I went to a really, really strict, like religious Jewish school, like the Jewish equivalent of Catholic school. Um, and so naturally, once I became aware of this idea of Kabbalah, like Jewish magic or Jewish mysticism, I was asking all the rabbis about it, my teachers. And generally they told me like the standard answer, well, you need to be 40 years old, have two kids, and have a business in order to study Kabbalah. So at that point I was like, okay, that's what I'm going to do with my life. And I got two kids. I turned 39 in September, a couple of businesses under my belt. So I'm ready to get started any time now, just, but I couldn't wait, being of the temperament I am. I continued to pursue and ask questions. And one of the teachers, rabbis, told me about what is still one of the first books I recommend to people, The Golden Bough by Fraser. And that's a very Western look at the history of folk magic, going back into the prehistoric. And since it was composed in the, I want to say 19th century, it's sort of stripped back already a layer or two from any books we get now, right? It's like a primary source material for books now, whereas back then it was collecting primary and secondary
And
sources.
the name of that book was?
Is The Golden Bough by W.G. Fraser. I want to say it's Walter G. Fraser, but if you have trouble sleeping, by the way, the Audible recording is really incredibly boring and will put you right there, I promise. It's a really good way to go to bed. It's a heavy read, but it affected my trajectory and my understanding of a lot of this stuff. At the same time, then not shortly thereafter, when I was 14, I was hit by a cargo van while I was a pedestrian on the sidewalk, and and that near-death experience left me with a lot of spiritual questions, left me with a lot of, theological questions, and ones that the rabbis couldn't necessarily answer because it was all theory for them, and it's to some extent I had a experiential phenomenon that they couldn't explain. So that left me kind of spiritually searching. And shortly thereafter, I got my first deck of tarot cards and started playing around with those. And it left me in my personal kind of trajectory in life to be puzzling over what I went through. I originally went to college on like a, full scholarship and all that at Rutgers, but really having these questions and these experiences that I was still trying to process, and stuff that I now have the terminology and the nomenclature and the framework to understand, and is kind of like my day job. At that time, I just couldn't even make sense of or converse with anyone about. So I quit school. Shortly thereafter, when I was 21, I started hanging out with like a new friend who smoked pot. I never smoked pot, going up till then. I was not into, drugs or anything like that. I was just studious and all that. But at that point, I started hanging out with friends who smoked pot. I tried it. I really hated the experience, but it helped with a lot of the headaches and other side effects, depression and stuff, PTSD and things like that from my accident. So I kept at it, and that became we'll call it an avocation for a while. But I became really interested in underground economics, things of that nature from that time period. And it put me in touch with a lot of kind of underground culture figures, you might say, that had varying spiritual and magical interests. So I kind of stayed on that search, and I decided to give school another shot and went back for cultural anthropology because that seemed to be, wrap up all these things I was thinking about. In the interim, I was doing a lot of self-study. I ended up reading a lot about shamanism and ultimately Native American religion. One of my mom's uncles was a Holocaust survivor who came here and married a Cherokee woman and lived as a Cherokee elder. And, so when he would come around for graduations and birthdays and stuff, he would pass along Native American lore and guidance around that. But my own self-study, it's funny, I went to college to learn about it, and I got there and I was like, are you kidding? I read all these books like 5 years ago. Let's talk about the advanced shit. I didn't necessarily find that in my classes, but I had access to the library and the stacks, and I was a really eager researcher. So, I did the stuff I was expected to do, and I really dove deep at that point into West African religion, juju, voodoo, whatever you want to call it. I'd had some exposure first as a kid, kind of going through the public library, looking through books. Just the area I grew up in, New Jersey, it's about 50-50 white and black. So there's a lot of like African studies books in the library and things like that. I had gotten at some point, God help me remember one of these days, but I can't, a book about how to deal with nightmares or dreams, and it said there's an old hoodoo trick in there. It mentioned it in that book, and that was the first time I heard about hoodoo. I was interested in voodoo, and specifically in voodoo dolls. I thought that was fascinating because if you read the Golden Bough, he describes a lot of that stuff, what we call king in effigy, is the term of art in the trade. But a lot of that using sort of simulacrum, he calls it the law of similarity, to sort of represent someone and affect from afar, or represent something and affect it from afar. So I was really interested in this, and we all have this kind of popular culture idea of a voodoo doll. And so searching for voodoo dolls, trying to find out more about voodoo dolls, led me, originally to look and see if these are an African thing, where if you look in Congo, you see what are called nkisi, which are inspirited statues, but which have nails driven into them. So it kind of looks like it might be a voodoo doll, but it is unrelated at all. And it's not used to punish the statue. The nails are actually used to bind oaths. And it's not the same thing as a voodoo doll. So looking back, it leads you to this idea of New Orleans voodoo, that kind of voodoo doll. It has nothing to do with Haitian voodoo, which I spent 3 semesters digging through to try to find something. Nope. But no, it leads you right back to New Orleans, closer to home than you'd think. And it entered the magical practice of New Orleans and that culture, what we call New Orleans voodoo, through sort of Scots English folk magic, where it's called a poppet. And that led me with, hey, wait a second, what is this, voodoo, ostensibly African magic, doing with a Scots English influence, which led me to really dive into this field that I now practice called hoodoo, which is, it's primarily, initially it was the spirituality and the religion of the slaves in the American South. And it has since then, even immediately in that time, because the slavery is a hot topic now. Very few people are yet discussing how many like Native Americans were enslaved and just listed as black, when in fact they were not of African origin. They just weren't white Europeans. So there was a lot of cultural exchange. Indigenous people, African people, exchanging cultural ideas. And so you start to have a milieu where things are mixing together. And ideas are being adopted. And that leads to something like a voodoo doll, right? Where you have ultimately African techniques being applied to a European technology. And we have things like that. That's very much defines hoodoo. It's this heart of African techniques and technologies that are sort of resourcefully applied in a non-African environment, in a diaspora. I would say that is a best capsule summary of it.
Okay.
So in terms of life story, from there, after studying in school, I just quietly collected occult books. My wife didn't even know that this was really what I was. She knew I had this huge case of antique books that were about occultism, but that I practiced or had any serious thought about this, was not discussed. I went on, started a business. My interest in cannabis put me in the cannabis industry for about 12 years, where I applied my, spiritual practices and occult techniques, if you will, to great success in building this business. Cashed out when I had my second kid, and I've been doing this full time ever since.
Your wife is one of the tribe?
What's that? Oh no, my wife is not. No, my wife is not.
She's a Shiksa?
Probably she is. Probably she is. Like, there's probably a grandma in there from what we've discovered. But yeah, no, she was raised Catholic, which is cool for me because like it's a big part now. Working with saints and stuff is a big part of my current practice, and it was pretty inaccessible to me until I kind of had a direct but she has like a family member who's an actual canonized saint, so it's pretty cool.
So we covered a whole lot in that blurb. I'd just like to unpack a few of it. You talked about when you first inquired to some of the rabbi at your Hebrew school about Kabbalah and what it was. They stated 40 years of age, 2 kids, and own a business. Why?
So there's a few reasons given. It's a great question because naturally that's my first question, right?
Because from outside perspective, it's like you're an old man telling a young kid like, okay, here's this milk list, this milk run, this laundry list of stuff you need to do, so that I basically don't have to tell you about something that I probably don't know about anyway. So
that's immediately what I was like. That's what I took it as, right? Like, I don't want to rebuke you. I don't want to shut you out. I'm going to make you feel like you got to go on a quest. Then I found, first I thought he made it up, right? Like at first I'm like, where'd you get that from? That's your milk list, your scavenger hunt. But then you find it's very commonly told. And the rabbis would repeat it to me over and over. And as I got older and asked why, it was explained to me that because the level, specifically in Kabbalah, and I have glimpsed it in my own like untutored, self-taught mad scientist approach, I kind of know what they're talking about. You can kind of reach such a sublime state. They call it ascending to the Garden of Paradise. You kind of access such a sublime state of meditation, you might call it, or trance, or blissful, I don't know, mode of thinking and processing that you can't come back. You can't participate in life. So the idea is that on the one hand, those are your obligations. It's your obligation to have a family, to reproduce. If you have one kid might die, so you have to have 2 kids, and to contribute to the world, start a business so your family can be provided for. So that if you go crazy studying this stuff, or you go become a mystic in the mountains and leave the world behind, you've fulfilled your obligation. That was the first explanation I got, and that was a good one. Okay. The second one I got was a little more practical, which was, well, it'll ground you. You know, you have material responsibilities. You can only sort of get detached from reality so much when the baby's crying because they're hungry. So it'll kind of snap you back to reality and keep you from getting lost in the, you know, and that is, of course, the big risk in all occult systems, just kind of getting lost in the esoterica. So the idea that, you know, material responsibilities, you got a mouths to feed, you got a business to run, you only have a few hours a day to focus on that stuff. You're kind of couched in the physical, so you can only get so far. It's a safety measure. And it wasn't really until I became a dad, till I had the second kid, that's when I realized the wisdom of it. Because when you have kids, Ace? You got any kids?
I fly light, man.
Okay, so, you know, when you get the first mouth to feed, it's a thing. But you're like, we got this. When you get that second one, it turns out that there's not a one-to-one. There's some sort of exponentiating thing. It's not like, okay, we have a 2 adults to 1 kid ratio, and we're going to a 1-to-1 ratio. The sum total of those 2 kids is much, or the whole of the 2 kids is much greater than the sum of the parts.
There's a synergy to the chaos spiral. Nice.
Oh yeah. The amount of mess that can be created by 2 children is not the amount of mess that can be created by 2 times 1 child. It is much greater.
And well, as somebody that flies light, allow me to give you all of my opinions on how you should parent. Because
please. But that, you know, that becomes the case where once you've had 2 kids and you got a business, you know, and you're, again, I'm not quite 40 yet. You know a couple things about a couple things. You know responsibility for damn sure. But more than anything else, you have been humbled. That's what having 2 kids does. It breaks you. It humbles you. You know, after you.
I would definitely say that being forced from a lack of options to clear smeared feces off of a wall would definitely ground you.
I mean, like, I've never been through boot camp, but I understand there's a lot of being yelled at while you have to clean in order to humble you. Parenthood does the exact same damn thing because that kid will yell at you, not help you, throw shit at your face. You know, there is no military code of conduct that binds the children, and they're not even yelling words at you. They're just yelling at you in a way and in a pitch that you're biologically tuned to be distressed by. So it's really like it makes a man of you for sure. And so now I understand because on the one hand, again, the humility that's developed. On the second hand, the sensitivity to nonverbal communication that's developed in raising a baby. On the third hand, the depth of emotional experience that comes from parenting. You know, from on the one hand, like when you, dude, should you choose to add to the cadre, man, the moment you lock eyes with your first child, you shift into a cognitive mode that you've never accessed before. It is just a different thing. I describe it as I could kill God right now. You have a reason. And like we all have reasons, right? Self-preservation, you know, faith in country, all that. But when you hold your own offspring, you have the reason. It's and like biologically so. It's
you're fighting for something that's bigger than yourself.
You become part of the link, you know, as we say, and you know, shifting into the spiritual, you're part now of the chain of generations. You have sort of ascended to pre-ancestorhood. And so you have an obligation to show someone that you are great.
That's one hell of an answer.
Yeah, man. That's what I got for you.
You talked a little bit about the wacky tobacco, the left-handed cigarettes, the devil's lettuce, reefer, the marijuana.
Yes.
What within the branch of occultism and specifically more the hoodoo, what is the importance or requirement for mind-altering substances?
So in the occult tradition at large, there is sort of it's interesting because occultism as we know it, you know, Western esotericism is mostly written by white guys in England for the most part, French thinkers as well. So their access to a lot of this stuff was limited. But when we look at like the Arab alchemists or the Chinese alchemists and stuff, they were doing some interesting things. The Egyptians, for sure, were doing some interesting things. Obviously, we know that shamanism relies heavily on mind-altering substances presently. And from shamanism, I get the best answer to your question. They say that the first shamans, when people lived outside and hunted their own food with their own hands and ate their food without a fire, those shamans could just go into the shamanic trance whenever they wanted. They just needed to sit down and they could go in the trance and see spirits and do everything. Then things progressed and the people came to live in teepees and wear clothes and have simple tools. And at that point, the shamans needed to dance, to exhaust their bodies and exhaust their minds to be able to enter trance. And then things advanced and they started setting up more permanent dwellings and keeping animals and domesticating more things, building relationships and having agreements. And then the shamans needed the drum to enter the trance. And then they came to live in society and live in houses and wear clothes and use money. And then the shamans needed the mushrooms to enter the trance. So it's this idea of like, how much do you need to free your, essential attention from the mental model that you're engaged in? And how far of an extreme do you need to go in order to do that? So to go back to your question, how necessary is it? It's not necessary if you have the capability of doing that. It's not necessary even if you don't. It's just going to limit how far into a trance state or, esoteric rapture you can go. Aleister Crowley wrote this whole book on hashish where he noted at the time, and let's be honest, Crowley had like a not nearly as good a hash connect as anyone who's alive today. But he wrote this whole little tract and he kind of says, well, if you use hashish, you can instantly within seconds get to the level of like a yogi of 30 years experience. It just puts you right into that state with no problem. But then it's very easy to go right past that and kind of put yourself in a stupor where you can't do anything. So is it conducive?
Yeah, that's kind of where I wind up, right? Like you said, you didn't touch stuff till you're about 21 years old.
Yeah.
I, by contrast, bought my first joint in a bathroom in 6th grade at an elementary school dance. And I didn't find it really did anything for me at all. And then later on when it finally did, whether it was like dealing with, we're talking I was early part of high school. We call it hippie crack. It was basically white hash. You take the crystal and roll it.
Sure.
After using a bud buster, some of that or some honey oil. Man, I was too gone to even surf the internet. And for me, right, like I know plenty of people out there that enjoy smoking dope, and all the power to them, right? Fill your boots. You can have my share too. It does for me does absolutely nothing. I am like, pardon me. There's nothing about the experience that I find positive. I don't feel I don't feel more open to new ideas. I just feel useless. And for the next several days, to me, it feels like my head's full of water. And when I talk to those people, like, oh man, you just need to try this other strain, and I'm like, I don't think that I do. I just think that it's not for me. Now, with that said, I'm a libertarian at heart, right? Like, if you wanna smoke dope, you wanna do some mescaline, like as long as you don't beat your wife or do something stupid, all the power to you, right?
Yeah, and honestly, my first experience of it is exactly what you're talking about, man. For the first, if it wasn't saving, like, I had this cost benefit where I would have these headaches, which I maybe get one every 18 months now, knock on wood. But I would get them multiple times a day and just incapacitating headaches. So it was this cost benefit of like, do I want to be incapacitated with pain or do I just want to feel lazy and hungry? And I was like, I go with lazy and hungry,
Yeah, I mean, with choosing between those two options, the lesser of evil for sure. For me, one of the reasons that I'm interested is to the role of things like mescaline or ergot root, or whether you're looking to fly Jarek mushroom or psilocybin
Oh,
mushroom, or
so when you're getting, past cannabis, when you're getting into like legitimate, what we'll call entheogens, and I'm not to discredit cannabis, like it is, I'm doing a whole class on its importance, 3-class series on its importance in spirituality and things like that. So not even to remotely discredit it, but the idea of really breaking out of your rational framework, your mental model, is cannabis sort of eases you through that boundary and plays with it. But, you do a heroic dose of mushrooms and you will never look at things the same ever again.
one of the questions that I'd like to hear your spin on, through the popularity of guys like Joe Rogan.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of doing DMT, whether it's mushrooms or sorry, DMT, you're looking at ayahuasca, you're smoking the straight stuff, going through and going on a mescaline bender, doing LSD. There seems to be this idea being pushed that these ideas that you arrive at and these beliefs that you arrive at, these experiences that you arrive at during that process, are somehow worth more than ones that you didn't. And the reason I'm skeptical about that is I'm a pretty straight-laced dude and have been since I quit that stuff when I was 15.
Mm.
And I've listened to a lot of the conversations that these people have had.
Yeah.
When they're gunned, right? Whether it's a guy who's drunk, whether it's a guy who's stoned off his ass, right? People that are on mushrooms, all of these things. And here's the thing. It looks like running through a cornfield or a forest on mushrooms is probably about one of the funnest things you could do.
Yeah.
But beyond the recreational side of, hey, this is awesome, the things that they're saying are absolutely moronic.
So
in my experience. And
I will say I've personally experienced the full range, the full gamut of I know, and I am a perfect test subject for this because I actually, one of the first times I kind of upped to like 5 grams of mushrooms, I recorded myself in multiple media, only for myself. I actually had streamed part of it, but I had an audio recording of myself. So there's a lot of meaningless babble in that recording, just hours of nonsense. But then there's about a 45-minute run in there where I just caught inspiration for a business model and I articulated it in detail. And I ended up applying it to phenomenal success, I don't know, about 8 years later to start my first business. And, it was a marijuana pipe company and we did, millions of dollars in sales in the first few years following that model. So it's not, I can't say it's all gold because there's definitely bullshit in there. There's just like nonsense, but it definitely, a few things. One, you filter out less. So less good, less bad. But two, you see self-imposed restrictions are no longer there. And so this is where I got to give you my second, and this was on a substance called 2CI that at the time was not yet, I don't even know if it's legal. It may still be legal in the United States. I used to order it from up north, from a research chemical site. 2CI was really interesting in its composition and its effect.
That's 2 Charlie India?
Yeah, numeral 2 Charlie India, yep. And
okay.
It was really weird. If you had any food in your stomach, it would take like 6 hours to kick in and it would completely ambush you later. And then you'd be like, oh, it's bunk. You'd go on about your day and it would surprise the hell out of you. But on an empty stomach, it worked like a normal thing. And it was my 23rd birthday. I took a bunch. 2CI was just kind of like in the ocean, kind of jumping around the waves. And I just had this whole boom. Hey, man, why are you afraid of people? Well, I'm afraid they're going to judge me. Well, when did you start thinking that? Oh, when I was a little kid. Well, have you rationally had any experience of people judging people and then kind of branding them with a scarlet letter for the rest of their life? Well, gee, no, and come to think of it, I think when people embarrass themselves, I think less of them. I really only remember when people impress me. So why don't you put yourself out there more? Well, maybe I should. Maybe I should start wearing brighter colors. Maybe I should start going out more. And completely changed me from being like not only socially awkward, but like extreme social anxiety to like the guy who organized all the events and all the other shit. Now, I'm still pretty misanthropic. That part didn't change, but like, I could never do something like this before. I would feel way too judged, like being on a podcast. So that kind of thing where like the ego is sort of dampened, the defenses are down. That's really in sort of the empathy category, I might call it, is really where a lot of this stuff is very interesting. That stuff that would be rejected out of hand is somehow reapproachable. And it takes the edges off things in that way. So, but it depends, man. You could sit there and just watch and I certainly have, even the same amount of mushrooms, sat there and just watched cartoons or done something stupid, and nothing of value is going to came from it. Maybe it could have, but it didn't. It's not a guaranteed. Oh, well, this is a ticket to heaven. I personally don't believe that it's a guaranteed anything. And I think I share a lot of your skepticism, actually, maybe believe it or not. But like I got a shaman and I'm going to go do my 8th ayahuasca trip this weekend. Like that's
that weekend.
Yeah.
The 8th one that weekend.
Well, no, I mean, people do like, oh, I did 3 last summer. I'm trying to get 3 in this summer type thing is what you hear. And here in the Boulder County in Colorado, it's like, that's a big deal. Like people are all about that shit. And I take a really dim view of it because coming from a cultural anthropology perspective, when I look at the cultures that these medicines were appropriated from, this is not something that people did every weekend. It's not something people did recreationally. It's not something that people did without guidance and preparation. And it's something that you really only did, at thresholds. A lot of my work now is about rites of passage. And a mega dose of hallucinogens is a really, really, really good one. I'll also say, though, microdosing, which is kind of like a whole separate topic, is a really interesting and promising field. You can almost think of it like vaccinating your brain against ignorance, because it forces your brain to use more of its pathways. And of course,
just a quick interjection. Anyone looking for kind of a resource or a gateway to information on microdosing, look into a book called Stealing Fire. It's available on Audibles, as well as on Amazon.
I don't know that one. I'll have to pick it. Your last book recommendation was spot on, so I'll have to grab that one.
The Spook That's Out by the Door?
Bro, that one.
That came from the Brother Shadow that I had on a little while ago. It was great.
I mean, that's like, I don't know if it's target market. I mean, like I love Chester Himes is my favorite writer, right? So African-American, Black, I don't say African-American usually because I find that term's generally inaccurate, but Black American writer who wrote like pulp noir. And so you sent me that book and I'm like, wait, it's all that and it's revolutionary? Oh boy, you got me excited. So thank you for that. Awesome.
I think Shadow said that it was written by a guy who was up top, and I think he was one of the founding members of the Black Guerrilla family. Because he came out of the Northeast, and kind of him being in the gladiator pit that he was, he rubbed elbows with a bunch of the guys that started Black Guerrilla family. The guys that were the Nation of Islam and their exponents that were kind of driven by the Elijah Muhammad, peace be upon him. And so that one came from him, but he was rubbing elbows with the guys who like started the Black Panthers.
That's
right. He was rubbing elbow and like had a lot of time to chop it up and hear their stories. And that was one of the books that one of those fellas wrote, and it's great.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting book.
From every aspect of it, like from just the pure as cultural commentary, phenomenal, Secondly, it's just so good. Like I mean, the detailed discussion of field tactics and stuff, the nuanced discussion of just also like the bureaucracies and things like that. It's just so smart.
It was a lot of fun. You'd mentioned just kind of getting back because the whole drug thing, like there's so many things that I want to get into with you. I've been waiting for this for so long. So you had mentioned that you had, some inspiration that came while you were stoned. So what I'll tell you is I get inspiration for lots of things all the time. Usually for me, it's when I'm alone and it's late at night, or I'm driving and it's just that quiet. So I'm able to go through and get all those inspirations and go through those exercises and using exercise of self-reflection, just kind of like, okay, well, why do I think that way? And I don't think that we need to be a part of the cool stoned club to get that value.
Well, and I'll say that I specifically, I don't think smoking a herb helps with that. I think for people who have anxiety, it can be helpful in reducing, just general stress. I think there's some people, though, it increases the anxiety for. I think even in the same person,
man.
You gotta go.
Like some of the stuff, yeah. People just like freaking out. Like, why are you peeking out? Why are you peeking out the window? It wasn't cocaine. It was weed.
Yeah, yeah. So, as with really many plants, and probably pharmaceuticals to a greater degree than our society likes to discuss, individual metabolism is going to come into play a huge amount. And then this individual psyche is going to come into play. And when we go into hallucinogens, two people can take the exact same dose of the same mushrooms, and one dude has, the sort of like cartoon bubblegum time of their life, and one either has a nightmarish experience. But I can tell the story of when I was with a bunch of people, including my now wife. We all took LSD. She had a bad interaction with her medication that made it so she basically felt sound in her body and spent the time terrified in the basement while the rest of us were laughing it up.
At her. Nice.
So,
she married you after that. So,
well, I ended up going down and comforting. I think that was a big win for me. But yeah, that definitely happens. And then, being where you're at mentally, they say it's set, setting, and drug. That's kind of the old school way of thinking about it. So what's your mindset? What's your setting? Where are you? And what did you take? Those are the three main primary variables in your experience.
Do you, for me, the reason that I'm fascinated by the drug side of it is going through and looking at working with people from a performance standpoint, as far as strength and conditioning, or somebody that just wants to be less fat. They just want to suck less. That's their success. They want to suck less.
Sure. They just don't want to be out of shape. They're not trying to get in peak shape. They're just trying to be not out of shape.
Exactly. And so there seems to be this tendency that's there, and just in general, where as a society or as human beings, we're not willing to do the actual work. We want the easy what's going to put us in this state. We want to smoke this thing. We want to hoop this thing, or whatever it is that puts us in that state. And so you said, well, sometimes I do this stuff and it doesn't do anything. There's a whole bunch of chaff. And then sometimes, and like there might be like a nugget of gold in there. And so my argument is, can't we just go through and get and do exercises, ask ourselves those questions, go through. I mean, like we look at some of these shamanic traditions, and we go through and we look at some of the new age types of religion, in which a lot of it's asking ourselves these questions. Mm-hmm. People like to poo-poo in Scientology. When you look into Scientology is repackaged Freudian psychology. Bro, why is it that I have this hang up, right? That's what is holding me back?
Just talking yesterday about, and this is to illustrate the point, right? Because I think you're spot on. I think what tends to happen with hallucinogens is your unconscious asks the question you need to be asked at that time that you wouldn't consciously come to ask yourself. Okay, so I think that is the thing where, like, if you had the audit list, which is what Scientology gives you, right? You have your audit checklist, and you run down that, and you're like, ooh, I'm hitting something there. There's something there with that one. Versus if you're just kind of sitting there trying to be like, thinking from the other end, like, why do I have this hang up, rather than what is this, what's the root cause of this? Or whatever, trying to auto-generate the questions versus having the questions provided to you, I'd say, is the distinguishing thing. But so when I was living in Oregon, I'd been kind of living loosey-goosey a little, and I went and took the only time I ever sat for a Scientology reading, and the dude was like, thought his machine was broken. He was like, you're like almost clear. how did you do this? What did you do? And I was like, bro, a lot of this 2CI stuff, some mushrooms and meditation and just introspection, being cool with those hangups is essentially what it comes down to. So I think it is very much the same thing. What I will also say too is, and what the bigger thing with like hallucinogens proper is, our experience of reality is entirely filtered, right? Like our hardware only operates in certain bandwidths. There's ultraviolet light we can't see. There's infrared light we can't see. Our software has hard biases built in. So, our brains are constantly flooded with anandamide, which is the natural cannabinoid that our body makes to help us forget things. So we don't remember every license plate, the texture of every object we've looked at. It helps us simplify. So like so much of our cognitive apparatus is to simplify, to reformat. I mean, the fact that vision actually comes in upside down and our brain flips it over, that's nuts. But we do it without thinking. And so we live in this filter. We live in this filtered reality. We have all these filters applied to just that raw hardware input to give us what we call cognitive experience. It's like our operating system. So if you ever played around with computers, bro, install Linux. It's a trip, man. You can do all kinds of stuff with your computer that you didn't realize you could do when you were running Windows or Mac, just using the front end of your Mac OS. Similarly, that's where hallucinogens to me are valuable. And let me make it clear. Like, I don't think it's wise or prudent to trip weekly, monthly, probably even yearly. I think it's something you got to experience, because just experiencing it once, switching up the filters just once, leaves you with just, I guess I'd say, an awareness of the fact that you're living through a filter. Because you can cognitively think about it, but it's that experiential reality.
Isn't that just a filter itself?
It's a different filter, right? It is. I'm not saying it's the true reality by any means. A lot of these people say that. I don't think it is. I think it's just a different filter. But when you sort of, through the contrast, you become awareness of the power of a filter. Does that make sense? Like it illustrates as much as
if I understand, you're saying that by going through and using something that allows you to see the world differently for a brief period of time, you understand that it is possible to see the world differently. Is that where we're kind of going?
To some extent, you're left with a kind of impression that the way we see things normally is as sort of, I don't want to say arbitrary, but as like frequency biased as the hallucination experience, as one might call it, like the psychedelic experience. It's not. I have personally never hallucinated. I've never seen something that wasn't there.
You just haven't been tired enough.
I've never hallucinated from like psilocybin or something like that. Now I haven't done DMT. I had a near-death experience. I know what I experienced there. It seems to fit the DMT archetype, but supposedly when I have done salvia, which kind of takes you out of this reality completely. So I guess in that case you do hallucinate, but it feels much more like imagining than like, oh, I thought that person was there and they're not really there. Now there's stuff like Datura, Jimson weed. Supposedly that'll do that to you, or Ambien. If you take a bunch of that sleep medication and stay awake, supposedly you'll see stuff that's not there. I have no interest in that. Certainly, if you've been driving too tired, I've seen a truck flip over in the middle of the road that was not there. But in terms of what the hallucinogen does to your mind, again, you're processing the exact same input through different filters and realizing again the difference between the sort of base signal and the filtered experience. That level of cognizance and that perspective carries over to even your standard base experience, whatever. And I think, by the way, we can absolutely, through exercise, through diet, through daily life, change our filters. Absolutely. It's just not as dramatic.
That's kind of the premise of things like cognitive behavioral therapy, right?
Right. And NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. I'm huge on NLP, and that's filter reprogramming. But the interesting thing about hallucinogens is it's like flipping a light switch on all your filters, right? You really get it. It's very dramatic. It's the difference between, if you haven't seen someone in 20 years, a little kid in 20 years, you're like, oh my God, you're a grown up. But if you're their parent, you've seen them grow up. You can appreciate the difference, but you don't have the shock.
That's an interesting way to put it. Yeah, I like that. And you're not advocating the having more cannabinoids and hallucinogens in your system than neurons either, with the tripping balls on the frequent.
I just 4 days ago got a call from a young lady who said, my boyfriend is like having a mental breakdown. He's taking LSD and psilocybin and ketamine, and he feels if he has the right amount of nitrous, he can access, the Jesus state inside of himself. And my advice to her was to break up with him, if that gives you an answer to your question.
oh yeah, that's going at high speed towards a cliff in the dark.
Yeah, that's I think there are wisdom, and I'll say this in general, right? In no culture is this the only medicine. What I mean is, look at mushrooms. That's a strong ally of mine, right? So like in the indigenous cultures that use the mushrooms for spiritual experiences, first of all, the mushroom is not for everyone, right? Even if you read like the Carlos Castaneda books, when he goes to Don Juan, first he tries the mushroom and he has a really bad trip. And Don Juan's like, that's not your ally. You got to try Jimson weed and you got to try peyote. And Jimson weed's not his ally either. So he has like these two really terrible experiences, and then he has peyote, and he's like, okay, this is your one for you. So there's this basic recognition that like different strokes for different folks, right? Like everyone has their own metabolism, as we were saying, and you're not, there's no uniform like, oh, this is your golden ticket. But the other thing is like, it is one of hundreds, if not thousands of plants that are used for medical, spiritual, social reasons, culinary, all these different reasons. It's just one of the plants. And why I say it's highly appropriative is you have subcultures, if you will, here, where it's like, we just take the ones that make you trip from all the cultures in the world and don't give a shit about the rest of their plant knowledge. That's so imbalanced, so appropriative, so quintessentially like internet era millennial, that it's really problematic. You can't approach these, speaking spiritually, you can't approach these spirits this way without like a court. And just speaking pragmatic, like culturally, you don't have the cultural milieu, you don't have the sensitivity, you don't have the surrounding knowledge, you don't have the perspective, what we call an emic perspective, an insider's perspective, like a framework of knowledge, a lattice work of understanding around that plant or that fungus or that whatever, to really operate it in its intended way, in anything like a focused way, which when you do in that way, actually the experiences can steer towards maybe not repeatable or predictable, but affected, right? Like you can sort of create an effect you want, steer towards an effect you want, rather than like, my bro just got me this, here, smoke it. Then there's, who knows, truly high speed towards a cliff in the dark.
So when we go through and we start talking about things like cultural appropriation, that's how culture shifts. It's how it changes, right? It's from subtle influences from other places. As one of the guys I had on a couple of weeks back, like Burley said, Jesus from Nazareth was not Jesus from Nazareth until he left Nazareth. And so we go through, right? We can go through and we can look at, if we want to use a Christian perspective, which can be easier for most of the people to follow along. There's a giant gap from the story of Jesus from when he's a child until and then he's suddenly a man. Right?
And there's there's other
we kind of go through just like that portion where you're in your teens going through puberty, up to about like you're 30. We'll just ignore that part. And so, depending on how far you want to get into it, the different stories talk about he went east. He went east to the mystery schools. He learned other knowledge, and he came back. And that knowledge we can go through and we can say, well, that knowledge was appropriated from another culture. And it was brought back, and it made the culture that he brought it back to richer because of it, and it itself molded. When we go through and we look at the use of something like, mescaline was culturally appropriated from the Navajo. I'm probably wrong on that, but right, like it was from this
The Yaqui, but there's a bunch of like southwestern native tribes that used it. Yeah, use it still.
in anyone who was in the area that figured out that you could trip balls probably
Right,
played.
right, exactly. They didn't have these distinctions like we have, and that's to the point, right? Because there's no culture owns a plant, but
Exactly. So, so we go through and like, oh well, there's this millennial stoner culture on the internet, and they just want to go through and like they're just interested what gets them high. And I agree that that's a toxic and terrible personality trait, and speaks to the people at hand. But the tribe that found that plant, that it was in that area, I mean, they didn't have traditions and ceremonies and everything like that initially. Initially, they were just tripping balls.
well, and initially a
And all
lot
that
of
stuff developed after, right?
absolutely when you go back to the root of it, and this is what I want to say, where it's kind of like a constellation of the with the environment, because when you go all the way back, people were just eating shit and seeing what happened. If you go far enough back where there's the first ancestors where there was no knowledge of eat this, not that, or eat this for nutrition, eat that, to give yourself a hard on, eat this if you want to see some crazy shit. You just ate, or you watched what the animals ate and watched how they acted afterwards. And then you thought, all right, they look like they were having a good time. I'd like to get into that. But also there was just, a lot of these stories come with someone who's going through the desert and there's nothing to eat and they saw this one plant. So that's what they ate. And then they met God. Interesting,
Burning bush, man.
Exactly. I mean, I believe very strongly in that, especially.
That was the acacia tree?
This is a rich line of questioning. But what I've always suspected that it was cannabis, because, there's been this underground theory that the Israelites were like Bedouin hash transporters for a long, long time, mostly held in sort of Rastafari circles. But recent archaeological evidence, like shit that's been dug up in the last 9 months, proves that the altars in Solomon's temple were burned a ton of cannabis with THC, like mixed with cow dung to lower the burning temperature so as to increase the smoke. And probably
like people are over there harvesting the resin right now.
And that's exactly it. When you look at the age of hashish production in the region, it's one of the oldest crops there, man. Like it's really like people have been doing that shit.
I don't think it grew that well in the desert.
It grows in the mountains. It grows in the mountains, okay. And there's so all cannabis. Everyone thinks there's cannabis sativa and cannabis indica. Rob Clark, brilliant researcher on cannabis, proved that it's actually all cannabis afghanica. Like cannabis sativa is what you make rope out of. And cannabis indica, I forget, like never existed or was something else, but it's all cannabis afghanica. So if you think of Afghanistan, that's where like the indigenous variety thrived. And those are the more hashy species. It got brought from there to, your Southeast Asia, South Asia, more tropical climates. But even in Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, India, kind of everywhere Jesus is said to have gone in that, that 20-year period, the plant was. And so that's actually an interesting parallel story now that I think about it.
That's fascinating. So we the work that man had done said that all cannabis and its derivatives came out of Afghanistan, and it spread because it definitely grows in Africa.
Yeah, no, it definitely grows in Africa. It definitely
it grows wild, like without it being farmed.
Yeah, and it's a slightly different. So you have there are other true varieties. There's cannabis chinensis, which is like a very viney Southeast Asian variety, and there's cannabis africanus is someone gave it that term, but yeah, it is like that bushweed. Here's what I know, and this is I think what he uncovered in the book, but didn't state this explicitly. One of the humans and cannabis have a tremendous amount in common. It's why it's been one of the longest domesticated plants, right? We've had this coevolution for virtually all of our mutual existences, or the majority of them, I should say. But both humans as you know from your work, and cannabis show a remarkable elasticity. That's like, in like body transformation, right? Like what 6 weeks can do, and then what 6 months can do. Like you can really completely double your mass, half your mass. The amount of transformation you can undergo physically is vast. You also know you can do the same thing mentally, right? That's what learning is, right? We can completely change our perspective, and like with a focused, intensive learning regimen, utterly change our brains and our experience of the reality and the filters and all that good stuff, right? So the range, when you think of like the biggest, strongest human to the smallest, weakest human, is fucking vast. And that's the case with just about all of our traits. Cannabis, unlike most plants, has the ability to do that. Now, all plants have that, right? Like that's evolution. But we have it such that, there's that 6-week cycle, just like we cycle in physical training, right? Like a 6-week cycle is a really, for whatever reason, for the human organism, a really reliable way to like shift into a new mode. And then there's the 10,000 reps thing. Like you do anything 10,000 times and you become highly proficient at it. Doesn't matter what it is. And so those kind of like that ability to shift in a relatively, or I should say, the ability to make those sorts of flexible changes many times in one lifetime is something that humans and cannabis have in common. So you can take a plant from a very high altitude, high and dry, bring it down to a place that's very, low and wet, and it will, maybe after a few generations, you may have to clone it so it adapts, but once it hardens off and adapts to it, it'll change the plant. It'll change the structure, change the taste, change the smell, and it'll turn into a different version of itself. We've seen plants taken from here in Colorado that were brought to the Virgin Islands, and within 6 to 9 months, it's an annual, so you have to take cuttings of it because it's meant to go, bud, die. That's what it does. So, but you take a cutting of it when it's in a vegetative state, and you keep doing it.
So just from, it sounds like you have a bit of a horticulture background. When we go through and we take a trimming, because we have a female and we don't want to waste time sorting out the males and worrying about if they get in there and go to seed, etc. When we go through and we prune that, we take that cutting, and then we grow that, and we take a cutting and we grow that, and so you get a plant that's 20 generations old. It's 20
times
same longer. Plant. What's that?
It's the same plant. It's literally a branch of that original plant. Essentially,
like it would be genetically identical, yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
So how does that change?
Same way it does in humans, my friend. Epigenetics.
Both the effect, but versus a brand new plant versus an old plant. So if we're talking about the use of psychedelics, psychotropics,
right,
within the occult, is going through and using a plant that's been kept going for 50 generations. Is there a greater effect or a greater value to that in the ritual in which? Because you're talking about, this is very adaptive, right?
So
right,
the value of
the memory of it, right?
So, and that's very interesting, and it's interesting how you put it. I really like that question. On the one hand, the value is that there's some amount of consistency, right? Because we said it's set, setting, and drug. Well, you can take the setting variable out of that, or at least sort of synchronize those settings on that variable. If you're doing the same ritual, right? If you've done the same ritual for every person, then the setting they're in, the sounds, the sights, the smells are all the same. Cool, that's the same. And if you can use literally the same plant for 50 or 100 or 200 years, then you're handling that other variable of drug. And if you have people initiated into the same, mysteries, as it's called, and like contemplating the same philosophy, essentially cultivating the same mindset, that's when you start to get to like, this is what that experience is. This is the total package. You've aligned all those variables. So your question, if I'm getting it, and I think it's a very, very astute one, is, are you really maintaining the synchronization of that drug variable because the drug itself is going to change slightly because of genetic drift, epigenetics, change over time? Is that basically your question?
Yeah. So people talk about that there's a memory within things, right? So if we go through and we keep that, that exact plant going for a long period of time, we regrow it, we regrow it. Does does it change? Does the effect of that plant change from the first cutting to the 50th cutting?
It can, I will say, because it doesn't always. And the goal would be to not have it happen. You know, the concept is, man, this was really primo. I want to have exactly this forever. Okay, typically around the third generation, there's some amount of settling. I don't really know how to describe it, but it third to fifth generation, from there,
Like
it kind of
it winds up being solidified as far as what it's going to do, what the makeup is going to be.
You might say it mellows. It mellows. So you might have something that's like really, really interesting smell and flavor. And then by the third generation, it's just like a little more bland, a little more run of the mill, and then it stays that forever. But you also have, and this is where cannabis is interesting, its expression is so keyed to the input it gets on every level. You know, you can take the cuttings off, you know, 2 branches off the same plant, and give 6 of them to me and 6 of them to you, and we can both do a great job with them, and they will both be different. There will be similarities, but they'll be different. I mean, it's that classic, you know, discussion in people of genetics versus environment, and it's
nature versus nurture.
Yeah, nature versus nurture, exactly. Like it's both. It's not one or the other.
The conversation of eugenics and personality traits as it applies to people and breeding is very, very taboo these days. Mainly because of a severely unfortunate incident involving your ancestors in the late 30s, early 40s. But before that, it was quite commonly thought about, right? Like Darwin was big into eugenics. It was a topic that was commonly discussed in high society. So you look at certain certain families would only marry within certain other families. The hilarious part about it is you wind up with a whole bunch of people that thought they really understood genetics and wound up being inbred, and they didn't understand the recessive genes and stuff like that. In some ways, it was hilarious, right? Like, oh, those eyes are really close together or far apart, or that's how we get hemophilia.
Yeah.
But what we can definitely see is there's certain traits that are going to exist within a terrier bloodline, right? Whether you're looking at a bull terrier or you're looking, right, like that type of bloodline, there's a certain level of gameness that exists there versus in a shepherd or versus in a a field hound of some description, right? And you can, and depending on what you can do, you can foster certain behaviors.
Yeah. And I think, you know, you can continue to breed like that, right? Like you have that in dogs, of course. You have that level of breeding. I think there's multiple layers of difference in human. And I believe a lot more in, because humans are so flexible, because of that principle we were just describing, to a much greater degree than other species, in such that like almost like adaptability is our specialized trait. You know, some animals are specialized runners, some are specialized biters, some are specialized climbers. We are specialized adapters. And so for us, so much of our setting is determined by environment. I would say that the boundaries, you know, your hardware is your genetics, and then your software is everything else. And if what we see from technology is you can do software overclocking, you can overcome maybe to some danger, maybe to some risk, whatever, but you can overcome hardware limitations with really good software. And I think that's absolutely the case for all humans, for just about all things. You know, when you see someone who has no arms doing CAD design with their toes, that's really interesting because I don't have the I don't know, it's manual if it's your hands. I don't know what it is if your toes, but
PDL maybe.
Yeah, dexterity to operate a mouse, let alone do something detailed. But hardware limitations, no problem. Build your own software patch in there, right? Like he wrote his own code, so to speak. No one taught him how to do that. He wrote his own code to enable that functionality, and I absolutely see that's the one thing that when you get into cultural anthropology and see what's the same and what's different around every culture in the world, you kind of start to see as like, okay, every culture has ways around food because that's a required, you know, there's a hardware requirement. You need food. Otherwise, the system won't work. But how they go about that is completely variable. And they can figure out a livable way to do it in any one of those systems.
That's a really interesting point. There's you're familiar with the comic Daredevil?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, there's actually a young man that's blind that taught himself echolocation.
Really, really? Like someone's really done that?
Oh yeah, I'll see if I can find you a video, and for those at home, I'll link it below. But yeah, he like to the point that he could just like tell where people were well enough that he could like chuck a pillow and hit his sister.
I mean, it makes sense. We have that capability in our hearing. We also hunted in the dark for a long, long, long time. Like we have the hardware capability. No one's run that software in a long time, but the functionality is still there. I think that's true
I
for
mean, just
most of
because you're blind doesn't mean you can't visualize, right?
Well, and exactly, you have an idea of space, right? Sound has depth and perspective and all that. Like sound has value. Um, so why not, right? We just happen to do it visually. It goes back to filters, right? You're processing the same stuff with a different filter.
What is the use in your branch of hoodoo of sound? What's the importance of it, right? Like yoga puts a strong emphasis on it, and
Sound is the most convenient way to move spirit. Sound
right?
is the most convenient way to move spirit. Why? Because it is our most, I will say, our most articulate capability, I guess, pun intended. There are just so many layers of meaning, of value that we can create with sound. Before we even get to like words, right? We can be loud. So we have volume, we have pitch, we have depth, we have all sorts of measures of tonality and
Different
uh,
types of intonation, yeah.
all of it. It's just a very efficient way of encoding information. And then when we add words on top of it, okay, now we have the multiple layers of word, right? The meaning of the word, sort of the reference point, the sound of the word, the sound wave it causes, and then the pronunciation of the word, which is like how we take that basic sound wave and modify it, customize it to the moment. When we take all that together, it's really powerful. So much power in both in sound and then in the word. Um, Again, if you've looked at any NLP or hypnosis or anything like that, so much emphasis on how you say things, because that is it has a profound effect on our psyche. And if you want to use, to me, that's also just filters or models, right? The difference between the psychological and the spiritual. We're talking about the same damn thing. We're just using different words to talk about it, and that limits how we can see it. So I find it both practical and functional and really necessary to be able to go back and forth and see it from all those different facets.
Yeah, you listen to this, listen to some of the ancient stories, like the story of the city of Jericho and how it was brought down, and then they've actually gone through and reproduced it. Or you look at what certain frequencies of sound will do to, if you take fine mesh silica,
Mm-hmm.
certain patterns are created, or the effects of it on water. And so then we go through and we look at some of the Vedic traditions, specifically yoga, right, where they use a lot of like Om being the universal, or sorry, probably the most well-known, but they use lots of mantras and chants and sounds. We go through and we look at the significance of things like a didgeridoo and drums.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, just drumming. If you've ever tranced out to drums, it's almost impossible not to. Like it's a biological working off harmonic vibrations, and that idea of harmonic vibration is so absolutely, it's so apt to the magical act, to what you're doing. Your harmonic vibration, right? You have a tuning fork, and you hit that tuning fork, and then sort of quote unquote magically through the air, a whole bunch of things in the room start singing. Um, Based on they're not connected with one another other than by the air. You know what I mean? That's the connecting point. And so there's this thing that when things are of a sympathetic composition and they are energized, that other things, the rest of the things in the field of that energy that have a sympathetic composition notice it, are affected by it, are somewhat similarly energized.
That's interesting. You use various frequencies of sound in the stuff that you do?
I mean, nothing has no words, right? Like even if it's just reading a Bible verse or reciting the Lord's Prayer, the way I recite the Lord's Prayer for every single thing I do, it's the same words, but the sound is completely different. That's where I put the meaning and even just the emphasis of the words. I So I use sound in everything I do. In terms of specific like frequencies, so to speak, I personally have used like binaural beats and like isochronic tones to a great deal. That's not necessarily part of conjure or anything like that, a hoodoo. Um, but drum is, the use of drums, chanting,
So does it
singing.
matter how those sounds are produced? Like if I'm going through and using a synthesizer to produce it through a subwoofer, or
If it's
I'm going
based on the
through and
principle of
using
harmonics,
some type of a reverb type of thing, whether I'm directing a skin drum through uh, a large tube to go through and create that, or I'm using something like a didgeridoo, something like an organ. Does it matter how it is that that's created as far as the effect?
on the harmonic level, no. If it's purely on a harmonic thing, like there's a difference in those sound waves that are coming out. If you were going to visualize them on a scope, they would be different. Even if you're playing the exact same note, they'd have different. What's the word? Timbre, Timbre. I know it's not timbre, so I'm not going to make that dumb mistake. But there's someone out there who's a music major who can tell me. But the voice is going to be different between those. So there's going to be some difference in
There's
what's
going to be
coming
a richness that isn't there in the one.
Well, and that translates. It's we perceive it as sound, but it is just differences in the wave. There's a wave in the air of energy, and our ears make it feel like sound in our brain, but it's just a wave. And so if we think of it as terms of the waveform, like there's a difference in that waveform. That's why it sounds different, right? You play an E on a bass guitar and an E on a piano. They're both the E, but there's one sounds like a bass guitar, one sounds like a piano. That's sort of that. So that's obviously going to be different. I think the other thing that comes into play with something like drumming, when you're doing the drumming, I think when you're listening to it or sort of being subjected to it, it makes very little difference. When you are yourself doing it, with didgeridoo, you have the additional thing of circular breathing, which may not be there in drumming, but then you have like what do they call that? Oh man, there's a whole type of therapy built around it. Bilateral stimulation, based on the rhythmic right and left side stimulation of your hands because you're hitting the drum. So that's going to have this other brain effect. You're going to have bilateral stimulation. Whereas when you're didging, which is what the hippie kids here call it, when you're playing didgeridoo, you have this whole circular breathing thing, which you don't have with the other stuff. So I think there's sort of like, in terms of the frequency effect, yeah, that's across the board. In terms of the sort of other ways you're stimulating your cognitive apparatus, I think that each one, each method offers different advantages.
Do you use a lot of breath work in your exponent? Like in the Vedic traditions, are big on breath work to go through and create certain states.
I personally do. It's not necessarily part of hoodoo writ large. If you take like a systemic review of it, it's how the chants and the prayers, and if you look at that old Southern tradition of prayer and spirituals, it's absolutely there. It's built in, the cantillation, as we call it, sort of the singing breath. But I personally do, because I've trained in a lot of, I went to a Buddhist school for my master's, so I got to train with some really good Zen trainers, and I have background in a few other things that I, use to enhance my and sort of streamline my state, just like cannabis. To be honest with you, like I and to your point earlier, the idea of taking a pill or the shortcut. I think there's whether it's whatever shortcut it is, taking a pill, taking the powder, taking the substance, getting the surgery. This was a big one for me. My younger brother was severely obese, and when he was like 15 years old or whatever, he got a gastric bypass surgery instead of like, losing the weight in a healthy way. And thank God he mostly is problem free. He's had some health problems, but I had a real issue with it. I was like, why are you taking the easy way? It didn't, no justification for that could come to me until I started learning a little bit about computer programming. And I'm not a master programmer. I've written some code, published some code, no big deal. No, I definitely couldn't get a job coding. But I learned about abstraction. Because I used to think about the same thing in terms of, spiritual practice, magic, straight up. And abstraction is such a powerful thing. Abstraction is why we don't have to write every program from scratch. We can bring libraries into the programs, right? If we want to use a network card for our program, let's say we want to, exfiltrate data from a network we are physically penetrating. Okay, well, we need to use the network card. Well, there's packages we can install. We don't have to write that from scratch. There's libraries we can install. We don't have to, figure out how to communicate with the network card. So we can abstract. That's a solved problem. That functionality is easy. So now we can start, instead of like trying to figure out how to solve problems based on simple commands, we can have these complex sets of commands that serve to add a functionality. And now we can solve problems using much more complex functionalities. For example, very simple, right? Like if you write a little segment of code to help you do your searching, and another one to display on your screen to display stuff, and then another one for your network card, et cetera, et cetera. When you accumulate these libraries, then you have the basis, the foundation set of like tools or capabilities that anyone writing code today has. But if you're going back to assembly, all you can do is take a memory register and put something in, turn it on or off. That's it, right? It's because we have, can abstract from the hard way, so to speak, that we have the functionality we have today in machines and computers. So the same in everything, right? Like if I can take a pill in theory, right? Let's say I could take a pill to maintain perfect bodily health. Well, then I could take perfect bodily health as a given for space exploration or, exploring the bottom of the ocean, which, by the way, I think is far more interesting than space exploration. And there's got to be some reason we're not doing this shit. And it's not because it's dark.
I'm guessing that's because you're more an interdimensional being than an extraterrestrial being kind of guy.
Well, very well put. But to me, it's just like, why are you going to spend all that rocket fuel to get up there? We haven't even checked out most of Earth yet. It's like you haven't seen most of your house. Yeah, you got to deal with darkness. You got to deal with extreme pressures. But guess what? You deal with those things in space. Oh my God, there's no air down there. Oh my God, there's no air up there. It's the same damn thing. But you automatically go there if you go in the ocean. You go to the bottom. That's where you're going. It's easier. That's maybe I'm oversimplifying this, but I have a feeling it's generally easier than going to the friggin' moon.
One of the things that is absolutely fascinating me and is very rarely discussed is everyone talks about the UFO phenomenon, unidentified flying objects.
Yes.
I work with some Acadian buddies, and they talk about, right, like ask someone who lives out on the coast, like hard on the coast, about UUOs, unidentified underwater objects, and those guys are out on fishing boats and stuff like that, and they're like, man, I know what whales look like. I know what a narwhal looks like. I don't know what that was.
Yep.
And there's a very famous story that happened in Nova Scotia back, 50 years or more. And there was an object, and it floated out over the harbor. It went down into the water, and then it went out to sea. But you don't really hear anyone discuss UUOs. They talk about UFO phenomenon all the time.
Well,
and it's fascinating. Like, if you know anyone out there knows someone who wants to talk about UUOs, hit me up, man. I'm game.
It fascinates me as well. I think how often we find new species at the bottom of the ocean, things like that. Like know
there is some weird shit, right? Like when you start going through and looking into octopus.
Exactly.
Like,
right? How
what?
weird do you want an alien to be? Because we have that a couple miles away from here.
Well, and just like, okay, right? We go through and we look at, oh, they can solve problems and we can't, right? They can get through
They
these
can
super
escape
tiny
their tanks
spaces
and stuff.
and they color
Yeah.
change, they have changed, they seem to have memory, they seem to express emotion and build relationships.
They can
Right?
recognize us. I can't recognize two different octopus, but they can tell the difference between two different people.
Fascinating, right? Even you go through and you look at, like, when you go through and listen to stories of shamanic traditions where they talk about the raven,
Mm.
right? Whether that's my family, my bloodline coming from Scandinavia, or you go through and you look at the way ravens are discussed here, with the local native tribes of varying persuasions. The raven is, right, like, we know, we've tested it, we can train them to do a whole bunch of things. They live for 30 years, they're intelligent, they have community, they seem to have some type of language, they can solve problems. If you screw with one raven, that raven will tell other ravens and they will remember you
Yo, oh, dude, my
and
daughter has
harass you.
remarked
Like,
many
your
times
car
that,
will always be covered in raven shit.
yep, I am friends with the ravens in our old neighborhood. They all, if I leave the house, a raven says what's up to me because I call back to them. That's all you need to do. And that you will, I know people have tamed ravens. You know, they'll come hang out. And you know,
I've heard anecdotes of, if you actually get one when they're young and I think you have to split their tongue, that you can actually get them to talk like a parrot, like they can actually reproduce.
oh, it's possible that it's just biological. But when you talk about parrots, like an African gray parrot, the level of intelligence and problem solving, and again, longevity, all that stuff, everything you're talking about, that makes them like or dolphins for that matter. We don't have to get that exotic. Like the degree of intelligence that these animals exhibit, it's not human intelligence necessarily, but their ability to solve problems, their understanding of humor and subtlety and all these different things, like there's more than just like we are the dominant species on this planet. We may be the messiest species on this planet, but we're not like
Well,
qualitatively a whole
we're the
level
ones that build the most things that we've observed, right?
that we've observed. The key point, right? And we do the most work. You know, I tend to favor a really Taoist perspective on things, where like work is waste. All work is waste. You know, if we have to endeavor, we're being foolish because the problem's already solved if we just plug into the solution. You know, you could go fetch the water, or you could live somewhere where it rains, type thing. So to some extent, you know, you can't take that to the extreme and just sit there and do nothing. But hyper efficiency, minimalism as a basic philosophy is definitely something I vibe with.
I agree that. I agree. Just kind of shifting veins here. Out of curiosity, why is it within the Abrahamic faiths, the big three, Judaism, Christianity, and its exponents, Judaism and its exponents, Islam and its exponents, why is it that the dark side of it is such, it's so, it exists, it's just not talked about? Why does it have this black mark?
I have
this black mark.
like
And when I say dark side, I mean, like, as much as the Catholics want to talk about Christianity being monotheistic, go to Rome, right? Like, there's a lot of saints, a lot of things that are getting offered to that aren't God.
yeah.
And there is the, right, like, you go through and you look at the whole idea of transubstantiation, right? Like, drink this wine, this is the blood of Christ, right? Eat this bread, right? It become, right. And
And
so
then you have a whole history of the clergy being the place that, you know, sort of harbored and fostered occultists for like 800 years in Europe. Like if you were into this shit, you became a monk or a priest. That's how you learned to read, and that's how you got access to books. I mean, if you wanted to learn anything, if you didn't want to learn trade, then you better be interested in this kind of thing. And then, you know, look at the Christian mystics. Everyone who ends up becoming a saint experienced some pretty crazy shit while they were alive. And was generally punished for it, usually killed, right? So to answer your question, I think we have to go back to Mesopotamia because we see the pattern there. You have this idea that the priesthood wanted to maintain mysteries. Why the priesthood wanted to maintain mysteries? Because your question was why?
Elitism, probably.
Well, you can take it a few different ways. On the one hand, and where I vibe with it, is quality control. You want someone out here saying they're a priest of whoever so-and-so, you want to be able to be damn sure that they are on the level. Because otherwise, you have this whole, trademark problem, right? This is what we call brand confusion in, the modern business environment. So brand confusion is a big problem. So you don't want that happening. I think that's altruistic. I think that's fine. You also have this thing, and that goes back way far, even, shamans, places that don't have the term where they just have a magic man. That person takes on an apprentice when the apprentice is sort of duly trained, comes into their own and absorbs the practice. That's really how it is in my tradition too. But there's this other idea that you see in what we call in any caste-based systems that has a priestly class, whether you're looking at India, whether you're looking, modern times, relatively modern times, India, and of course the Abrahamic religions. But, you can add Sumeria, you can add Mesopotamia, you can certainly add Egypt to this, in later Egyptian life. These are societies that depend on society-wide coordinated agriculture. Agriculture is based on an understanding of the seasons and the stars. And we still use the Farmer's Almanac to predict things with remarkable accuracy a year out based on astrology primarily. And the priestly classes were charged with keeping these, astrology being one of the esoteric secrets.
Well, like the whole celebration of Easter, right, it's about when you plant the crops.
Right. And,
from the pagan goddess Ishtar.
The rites of Osiris are all about the Nile, and the Nile was significant because it had to do with the flow of the Nile, had to do with how the crops were going to grow. So the priesthood...
Does the Nile flow to Kilimanjaro?
Doesn't the Nile flow south to north, and that's what makes it interesting?
I'm asking. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But what I will say is the priesthood so much depended on the priesthood. And you also see at the same time, these people who kept the stars got a tithe, right? So you're going to get a cut of the profits if you tell us when to plant, when to harvest, when to whatever. So now you have a really vested interest. Again, you could take the altruistic approach and say, and make sure that they never mislead the people and make the wrong predictions. Or you could say, no, these guys had it easy and they wanted to pass that on. They wanted to enable that for their kids, which is why you see the priesthood transmitted, or down paternal lines and things like that in many cultures, as in, the Israelites, right? The Levites became a caste of priests, essentially, who...
Nepotism's a thing for sure.
Well, and to go back to your earlier point, like whether it's genetic or it's just folkways of the family, they make good priests. Families have trades, and there's something to that because there's subtle knowledge. I learned shit about sales and business from my dad, literally the earliest memories I can remember. And I don't mean like how to do, how to transact money necessarily, but just sales psychology or whatever you would call it, just thinking about business. It was just normal conversation, lessons that my dad would give me, and I'm sure I give them to my daughter. So I think,
well, just exposure, right? But
yeah,
I mean, there's this idea of immortality. Every parent, every father, especially of his son, wants his son to grow up to be a man as good as he was or better. Mm-hmm. And the easiest way to go through and establish your son's position, your lineage's position as being better, is to start teaching them what took you a lifetime to learn. Start teaching that to them earlier.
Right. And then they at least pick up, they're starting from where you finished.
Yeah. A good buddy of mine, Raffi Katz, he's a rabbi in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. His son just wound up doing his bar mitzvah during the middle of this. It was online.
I just did a Zoom bar mitzvah on Saturday. That's funny. I attended a Zoom bar mitzvah.
And it was him and his wife had me at their house for Shabbat supper, and it was just fascinating to see the traditions that are kept alive. And if his boy, I believe his name is Mendel, if he grows up to be to fall in his father's footsteps, it wouldn't surprise me. And if he were to do that, he would probably be even better of a rabbi and even better of a leader than his father is. And Rafi's a hell of a guy, but just to grow up with that level of example of this is how you run your family, this is how you are, this is how you, right? To have that ingrained right from the get-go versus having to be reined in later.
It just gives you a different starting point, right? And so, you can even think of it like a model of two-dimensional space. You can go further towards one end of the thing than if you had started further towards the other end. You're
exactly. Yeah.
You're closer to where you got to be, or you're, and also it lets you kind of, in some ways, shift course. And my dad's, I'm a first generation American on my dad's side. My dad came here. My mom's parents came here. So a lot of their stuff was just focused on like setting up the baseline, establishing, how does America work? How does capitalism work? How does a society that has these ideals work? And like, thankfully they were able to pass that right to me. And now I can have all kinds of fun with it, but that wasn't accessible to them because they were still working on the foundation of it, and I think that goes to all, that idea of abstraction, right? Like my parents taught me how to, I don't know, manage money. And so I didn't listen to them, but they taught me how to do it really early on. So I didn't have to figure that shit out for myself, or even something as simple as like, they were able to help me with my undergraduate because they had money because they had focused on doing that. So now I was able to get undergraduate and get a master's.
That's that definitely helps. Anyone that's into financial stuff, or is kind of looking to go down that rabbit hole, there's one book called The Richest Man in Babylon. Everything else that has come out since is more or less just that repackaged.
I'm going to give you one more that you gotta check out. It's called "I Will Teach You to Be Rich." And Ace, for you, actually, it's really good because it's written for like, someone who's traveling light. It's applicable to me, and I took things from it, but it's much more for like your situation, man. It's "I Will Teach You to Be Rich" by Ramit Sethi. I cannot strongly recommend that enough. And of course, The Millionaire Next Door is a really good book. Kind of get into the mindset and the life habits of millionaires and see that, as a matter of fact, buying a $10,000 watch is not something millionaires do.
It's something that a billionaire might do.
Billionaires certainly do. Yeah.
There's a follow-up to Millionaire Next Door called Millionaire Mindset. And it's for anyone that's listening at home, it's case studies. All right. So you read Millionaire Mindset, Millionaire Next Door as if you're going through a recipe book. And so it helps you navigate and gives you the math on a bunch of choices like, okay, I'm going to buy a car. Okay, well, what kind of car do rich people buy? Well, self-made millionaires usually buy this and they keep it for this long. And this is typically what they do. And here's the math on that. What's the most commonly owned the two most common brands of watch? Timex and Casio. So yeah, to Brother Moses' point, like, yeah, just make better choices, and it saves you the math, right? Like, oh, yeah, I like that. That makes sense.
Yeah, you don't have to figure it out for yourself. Exactly. I mean, we drive a old ass Honda Civic and an old ass Honda CRV. Try to keep multiple streams of income.
Hey, you can laugh, but it's paid for.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I'm
right?
way
like,
past
it's
broke
paid
even.
For, man. Done.
Well, yeah, exactly. And people think rich people sort of ball out, but no, that is not. Corporations ball out. People do not.
What is so you said you grew up in a fairly traditional, strict Jewish background. Was there, I'm not sure what the word for it is in Hebrew or Yiddish. In Arabic, they refer to the jinn, sometimes
Mhm.
spelled Jinn,
So
sometimes written or
yeah, the two
romanized
things we have,
Djinn.
we don't. So in the Persian side, yes, they have jinn. And because that's all over the Near East, Middle East, and it was like almost like a boogeyman type thing that you would get you told about. There wasn't a knowledge necessarily passed down. The evil eye was a big one. That was this thing you were scared of. And then in Eastern European Judaism, there's a Dybbuk. A Dybbuk is what in Afro-Cuban systems they would call a muerto. It's like an undead spirit that's kind of earthbound or hasn't ascended in some way. It's a wicked spirit that's
Like
kind of hanging
someone
out your
stuck in purgatory kind of thing.
yeah, but they're here like causing trouble. A Dybbuk will really fuck you up if it gets around you and in you. Judaism used to have this like very strong tradition of spirit possession, things like that, um, and it's mostly been lost in the past, say 300, 400 years. But yeah, it was a big part, and the Dybbuk fear goes back to then.
Why is it that you think a lot of this side of it, um, the esoteric, the casting, the equivalent of casting of ruins, even the discussion of jinn and and kind of the spookier sides of it. Why has that been washed away?
I think because it goes back, chips away at the um, authority of the priesthood. Right? You have this priestly caste that's getting paid taxes and you know keeping mysteries. And if anyone shows up, you're supposed to chase them away with the sword. They're not allowed to see what you're doing. Um, I think it is a rule imposed by them to kind of keep it under control. I think there's also, you take the altruistic approach that there is danger in using these things unwisely. There absolutely is. Um,
So
Divination.
maybe I didn't ask the question properly. So this stuff isn't really spoken about openly, right?
Right.
Like you can go through and control a knowledge base with it still being aware, but the majority of people, this stuff's only spoken in whispers if it's even known at all.
Right. I think because it's taboo. It enters that realm of taboo. People are afraid of what they don't know. They don't know anything about it. And so it's very scary. They hear certainly the horror stories of what happens when it ends when things go wrong. But just like with drugs, really.
Yeah, it's uh, when where I grew up, there's some interesting stories that I heard from my parents' moms who kind of came to bloom in Age of Aquarius with Ouija boards and stuff like that gone wrong.
Yeah, Ouija boards are something that I will not do. It's one of the few practices that you cannot. I will not consult a Ouija board. It is spiritually speaking, it's a dangerous practice. It's funny that it became sort of this very common one.
Why is it? Why is it so dangerous?
So like mediumship, you are allowing a spirit to act through you. In the case of a Ouija board, you're allowing them to act through your physical, locomotion, movement of your body. And if you don't have adequate discernment, it's kind of like would you let anyone walking by who wants to use your bathroom? No. Would you let anyone walking by who wants to sleep in your bed sleep in your bed? No. Would you let anyone who's walking by who wants to control your body control your body? Should be a hard no there.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so you think that the of as far as things that are in the common consciousness that Ouija boards are the most dangerous of that variety.
Yeah, I would say so. Compared to like tarot cards or pendulum divination or you know, yeah. Ouija boards because it involves that act of physical mediumship. Automatic writing would be similar. Automatic writing would also kind of involves physical mediumship. Um, but because automatic writing has some rationality to it, you're not just scribbling lines on a page. There's more either conscious presence or discernment on the spirit that can function. With a Ouija board, since it's just really basic movement, like a really base spirit can pull that off. It doesn't mean that the information is accurate. It's just information.
That's fair. Why is it so? In one of my favorite lines that comes out of Christian faith is they say, "As above, so below," and it seems to reflect a lot of things. Anywhere where Catholicism is gone, and I speak of that because it's what I know better. Anywhere where that is gone, whether it's the Philippines, whether it's down in Mexico. In the Philippines, you have something called unting unting, right? And people are Catholic, but they also have unting unting, and it's essentially a mixture of like emuleta. Sometimes it's words written, and it's incantation. You go through and you get into kind of Latin America, you see things from Obeah to Voodoo to Juju to Santeria to Santa Muerte. And what's fascinating is for the majority of people that follow this stuff, they don't see it at odds.
No, I was thinking about this the other day.
Whatever vein.
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day. You know, I define my denomination as spiritualism. You know, and that's generally what this mode is. Animism, basically. So it's not blasphemous because fundamentally in all these traditions, there's God, for sure. There's no denial of God. And then
is it seen as heretism though?
Not internal, no. You know, I don't think it's heresy. Like kind of how the way I think of it, and the way I've heard, you know, Olarishas, what people will call Santeros, but you know, people involved in the syncretized practices say, well, you look at the Catholics and then you look at the Russian Orthodox and they have different saints. But there's God and then there's saints, and it all works the same way. And just they have some of the same saints. Like Saint Michael, it doesn't matter if you go to Ethiopia, you know, Rome, or you know, Greek Orthodox Church. Michael's a saint everywhere, even Judaism and Islam. But then, like, you know, there's different denominations have different saints. So these are just different saints. None of them undermines the authority of the Almighty.
Why is it that you think that there's this? So from my perspective, it seems that there is a real, for lack of a better word, lust to have that other side, that less talked about side, that kind of so below, because it exists everywhere. There seems to be this fascination with it. We are drawn to it on a almost an innate level, a primal level. Why is that?
I mean, I think that's what makes us a complete human. You know, I'm a big proponent for the shadow journey, psychologically and spiritually. I think that
for the shadow realm, you said?
Shadow journey is kind of what psychologists call it. But
okay.
If we think of our psyche or ourselves, our concept of self, as having the things that we treasure and adore, and the sort of inspirations that we listen to and honor, and then those other ones that we like shut in the basement. I always think of like the Simpsons Halloween episode where there's that other Bart, Hugo, the sort of monster Bart that lives in the basement that they throw the fish heads to or whatever. And then there's one Halloween they did one where they brought Hugo out of the basement and they treated him with like dignity and you know, cleaned him up and let him eat with the family, and he came to replace Bart. And they switched him with Bart. And there's this idea that like part of why these things are, you know, what is taboo is that we make it taboo, so to block it off from ourselves.
Are we going down the everything is a construct line of thinking?
No, I just mean, like, for example, death is taboo. We have a death taboo in Western culture. Talking about death, thinking about death. I can't get my mom to even discuss like funerary plans. Death is taboo, which is fucking absurd because we're all going to have it. Sex is taboo. We don't talk about it. It's inappropriate for some reason, but we all do it. So we have parts of ourselves that are preoccupied with these things because we all do it, and all the more so because we don't have an outlet for it. And so so much of this is taking what you don't have an outlet for or don't have an input to and facilitating that process. You know, the input-output processes with these parts of ourselves that we lock away or ignore, right? Like that, the urge to the fear of death, the acceptance of death, the relationship to death is something that we all by default, by the fact that we are alive, contemplate, and we have no mechanism for doing that. So there are death cults, naturally. There are sex cults naturally. All these things arise, and because there's unknowns around them. Anywhere where there's unknowns, we want more control. I mean, it's not that different from people hoarding toilet paper during coronavirus in some way, right? We want some control. We want some sense of predictable.
I definitely think that the search for meaning gives us comfort, right? We as human beings tend to look towards pattern and organization and things like that. I think one of the reasons that conspiracy theories are so common is because they bring comfort. They bring comfort in the idea that there is some partly smoke-filled room of shadowy figures, right? Perhaps it's the Majestic 12, or it's the Illuminati, or right, it's the Elders of Zion, or whoever that is. But there's like this board that's logically thinking about how this is going to work through, and that we're not just on some rock hurtling through space at a speed that you can't even kind of figure out. Around a giant semi-contained nuclear explosion that's been going on for several billion years.
It gives the idea that like maybe you're not the one in control, but this is all controllable. And maybe the ones who are controlling it, we don't agree with the way they're controlling it, but it can all be controllable, as opposed to like, nope, we have just been reacting to chaos since we became aware of it, as we're becoming progressively aware of it.
On the topic of chaos, are you familiar with the chaos magic?
Yeah, I call chaos magic the folk magic of pop culture.
Okay. Explain that. Let's unpack it.
So chaos magic has a lot to do with, I have a couple chaos magic books on the shelf behind me. It has to do with like creating your own magical system. It draws heavily, first of all, on pop culture, and it tends to be like folk magic, kind of loosey-goosey and work off principles.
So it's kind of the Diet Coke of magic.
You could even call it the Coca-Cola of magic, as opposed to the like, fresh squeezed juice of magic, right? Like there is something highly synthetic about it. It works. You could, shit, man. You can live your whole life only drinking Coca-Cola.
Well, you can and you can't. There's a guy that I know, or that I work with, that decided to go down that rabbit hole, and by his own admission was drinking 12 to 14 cans of Coca-Cola a day, and he gave himself a pretty predictable result.
Well, again, you can live your whole life. You can't say how long that life will be.
That's a fair statement.
But it's same with chaos magic. You're going a bit into the unknown. I tend to be a little more cautious than that, just as it's my mindset and everything. So yeah, I tend to not want to just jump into and make my own shit up. That said, like William S. Burroughs has had a huge impact on chaos magic, and I did my thesis work on his occult, beliefs and practices and things like that. So I have a great deal of respect for some of the founders of the field of chaos magic. I think it, much like my critique of appropriation, because as you were saying, I'm a huge proponent of cultural exchange. I primarily practice an African-American system of spirituality. That's right there. The difference between cultural exchange and cultural appropriation is it in context? Because if it's outside of context, then a lot of the hows and the whys are lost. And that's when we can start to get into dangerous territory. And to me, that's what folk magic, or what chaos magic can get into.
On the top of cultural appropriation, which is a bit of a hot button thing these days, I think that the whole line of that whole line, like going down that whole line, is a little bit silly. Because it isn't until another culture looks at what it is, like one culture looks at what another culture does and starts to internalize it, that it's viewed through different eyes.
Well,
and
I'll put it like this.
I don't know what I don't know, and if I've been doing something a certain way. So say I've right, there's a common story of taking the roast and cutting it into two and putting it in the oven.
Mm.
And we cut it in two, we put it into two pans, right? We put it in the oven, right? You do your mirepoix, all that. And this went on for, 20 some years. And one day the child who's now grown asks his mom, says, "Why did we cut the roast and use two roasters?" And the mother goes, "Well, that's because that's how my mother showed me how to do it."
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, okay, but why? So she calls up her mother and says, "When we make the roast, we do it like this." She said, "Yeah. Why do we do it that way?" Because I didn't have a big roaster.
Yeah, there's always some like pragmatic it's not about the roast, it's about adapting to the situation. It's just how it's done.
And so we wind up with this situation where we're going through and doing something because that's the way we've done it.
And that's where that
until another culture comes in and says, "Well, hey, like, do we even need to do that?"
Right.
we can see some change. And the whole idea of cultural appropriation being insulting, it's not. It's right. Like, so if we go through and we talk about the right,
I think the
out
idea of it being insulting is ridiculous.
Culture. It's one culture goes through and says, "Hey, that's really neat. That's novel. That's got some value. That's cool." And that's when it starts kind of filtering through. That's the opposite of an insult.
Yeah, it's really interesting you put it that way. When I first started, working with like Black Southern teachers, and it started as a cultural exchange. They were learning about Judaism. I was learning about their culture. And I said, it's so interesting that people feel like they want to not share, because I could think of like the reaction that, Jewish culture has. If you see someone who's not Jewish, like wearing a yarmulke or something in public, you inquire, of course, you want to make sure that they don't mean it. They're not doing it to like lampoon or, satirize or anything. But if they're genuinely interested, I feel like then you just tell them, how can I help? That kind of thing. I think cultural appropriation being insulting, no. But can cultural appropriation cause people to miss the point? I'll put it like this. If a guy just went to China and said, "Oh, they can cure disease by sticking needles in people," and then went home without learning about the meridian system, without learning the technique of acupuncture, and then just started shoving needles in people, it wouldn't do what he thinks it's going to do. That's my take on it. Like, you got to understand it in context if you want to have that technique or that technology function the same way for you.
100%. There's definitely an exchange that goes along, right? Like, you go through and you look at an example everyone can get a hold of. Look at boxing, right? The way the boxing was done up to a certain point was, you and I are just gonna like throw bombs at one another until one of us has a better chin and a harder punch, and may the most durable man last.
Right.
And then you saw a fellow named Jack Johnson come about.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when boxing really started to shift. Right.
And then it just keeps going from there, right? You get Willie Pep, and then you have.
But it wasn't until that, right? It wasn't until Jack Johnson. It wasn't until like boxing was kind of absorbed by a different culture and started like, okay, well, like, hey, like I want to look good. I want to be pretty. I'm not just standing in front trading blows, but that's the way it was done.
Right.
So it wasn't until another culture started playing with it until that influence came in. And if you go through and you look at even like Jack Johnson, by the standard of boxing today, probably wouldn't even make it past an amateur level.
Yeah.
But for the time,
right,
that started going, and then it started developing in a different way and became something that we accept as the sweet science.
What's boxing is a great example when we talk about cultural exchange too, because it has that always grass is greener thing to it. When we in the States in the 60s and 70s, when we had the karate craze and the kung fu craze, in Asia they just wanted to learn boxing and wrestling. It's always, the forbidden fruit is always sweeter.
Well, it's what is new and what is novel.
Right, exactly. It's new, what's novel, because of that thing we keep coming to. We get this idea of recombination, where you have your baseline set of knowledge or whatever it is, and you get something new to that, and now you have new and interesting possibilities. It's how things are advanced. It is how cultures develop.
You go through and you look at Japan, which is a fascinating microcosm of culture and how it works. The Japanese, they love the idea of Americanism. There is
yeah.
subcultures that are entirely based around looking like you're from the movie Grease.
Like, and they do it to a hyper degree. They look
Like I'm
hyper
talking
American.
like you're John Travolta, you got a pompadour, leather jacket, white t-shirt, blue jeans, the look, right?
Yeah.
But there's all right. So is that insulting? No, it's kind of cool, right? They're really into that, and that's why they're doing it. You go through and you look at there's a Rastafarian cult, a Rastafarian subculture that exists in Japan.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
I actually
There is no idea of Rasta in Japan that's indigenous.
Right. Yeah, there's no idea of Rasta anywhere that's indigenous, which is an interesting point in and of itself. But the idea of cultural appropriation, and this is me speaking strictly as like academic anthropology, it is the product of an outrage culture in academia, and it leaked out of academia into culture at large, as with a lot of things, and I should also say, sometimes, generally speaking, we look at something that made a lot of sense in academia, that when it gets, again, out of context into the culture at large, there are people who can't take it subtly, and they take it they take it more personally than it was ever intended, and that causes uproar. Now, I think there's another difference with cultural appropriation and cultural sharing. When there's cultural sharing, it's acknowledged. The source is generally acknowledged, right? We call it this style or that style, or this method. Even within a culture, right? You look at, I know you did an episode recently on like Chinese boxing, and like there's so many different styles. Those are basically family styles across many different cultures within China at that time. And like, it wasn't cultural appropriation, because you would say, this is Yang style. Like, I got this is the Yang family style. This is how they do it in that region. So as long as you're giving credit, I think when your cultural appropriation is saying, check out my shit, that's where I think it gets appropriated. It's just like plagiarism, right? Is it improper to include someone else's thought in your work? Absolutely not. Is it improper to do it and not give them credit? Well, then you're plagiarizing. Then you're kind of being sketch.
So if we go down that line, every single thing that I do, that I've been taught in my life, has come from someone else. Sure. So when I go through and I start doing long division, do I go through and credit Mrs. Stevenson that taught me how to do it in second grade?
Well, did Mrs. Stevenson develop it or transmit it to you?
Well, she credit the originator. That's where I got it from, right? So, I'm being hyperbolic and putting up a straw man on purpose, but
yeah,
like, so at what point do we go through and say, okay, well, this is where this came from, this is where this came from, right? The point that we start to internalize that, or in order to internalize that, we have to stop going through and doing that as a part of the process. Like, okay, well,
at some point
you can go through and they know where things come from just based on that understanding. A really good example is a girl wearing a girl that has a feather in her hair.
Sure.
And so some people are like, well, that's culturally appropriated from the Aboriginal people of North America.
Fuck that, man. Anywhere there was birds and
anywhere
hair,
where there was a bird that had nice feathers, people put feathers in their hair.
Now, a girl wearing a specifically like certain tribes' headdress style is different, right? Like there's ranges of this stuff, because if you're just taking something that we all had, like, putting something as simple as putting a feather in your hair, or using a certain color in your clothing, like everyone had clothing of certain colors because there's plants of that color everywhere.
There's certain things that seem to exist everywhere. Like, so you go through and you look at the example of the swastika. The swastika was culturally appropriated by the Nazis, and they got it from the Romans, but it was also used in Buddhist culture. Yep. I've seen examples of the swastika being used in Aboriginal beadwork. Right, but
there's a Thunderbird representation of the swastika. It's associated actually with thunder symbolism in a lot of cultures.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, absolutely. We have there's certain archetypal
and the Thunderbird and the golden eagle from the Romans, which was the same one used by the Nazis, looks remarkably similar.
And so we have, there's archetype on one level, and that's shared, right? But then there's, again, there's a difference between you using a word you heard me use, or even using a phrase you heard me use, or using a line you heard me use, or repeating my entire speech and saying it's yours. There's somewhere in there, there's a difference.
That's a fair statement.
So where that fine line is, I'm not sure I'm qualified to call that, but I could, somewhere in there, it's offensive if you don't give me credit, right? Like if you're going to repeat an entire 2-hour class I gave verbatim, I'm pretty pissed, especially if you made money off that, If you're going to say a sentence I said, or especially if you give me credit, like I'm honored. So
yeah, I
think
I try to view things like as
I object to in cultural appropriation. My issue in cultural appropriation, which is not that sort of like sensitivity issue, but just the practical functionality issue, is if you misunderstood what I said and quote me out of context to prove a point I wasn't trying to make, that fucking pisses me off, dude.
A full stop. I get
that. That's not what I was trying to say, whether you understood it or not. But that's not the point I was trying to make. No, we're not going there. So that's it. On that note, my friend, we've gone over 2 hours here, which is phenomenal.
Whirlwind. Okay, let's push through these questions real quick. Why does what you do suck? What's terrible about it?
What's terrible about it?
What's the silliness that's associated with it?
There's some really, 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 really people who really need a type of help that I can't provide, that reach out to me, and it sucks sometimes dealing with them, and it sucks that I can't help them. A lot of people with like emotional problems, personal problems that can't be remedied spiritually, like, yeah, I'm not the guy to talk to for that. So that is, for me, as kind of like an empathetic person, that's what sucks the most.
So you're of the school of thought that hoodoo and the occult and the spiritual side of it, it's a tool in the toolbox. It's like sometimes you just need some pharmacology. You need a value.
I mean, there's that. There's all kinds of situations, like sometimes he ain't the right guy for you. I get that you want to get him back, but you got to get over it, And we find, like, often if we do provide the spiritual solution there, you can get the guy to come back, but he's going to do the same damn thing or leave or whatever. It's not, and all that comes down to is like, you're stuck on this guy because you have low self-esteem. Like, you should work on your self-esteem. It's not a solution I have for you. That's a solution that resides within you.
That's fair. What piece of advice would you go back in time and give your younger self?
Oh, that go for it. No, nobody knows what the fuck they're doing. That's the biggest advice I can give anyone. No, literally nobody knows what the fuck they're doing. So just go for it.
What 3 books do you find, or would you recommend?
On magic, it's very easy. In general, it's more difficult. On magic,
so let's talk both. Let's talk magic specific.
Okay, so magic first. As I said before, the Golden Bough. I recommend them in this order: The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall, The Golden Bough by Fraser, and then The Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic by Levi. There's a lot of reasons why I say it in that order, but do it in that order. In general,
that's Anton.
Oh no, so Eliphas Levi, Levi.
What was the last one?
So the Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic by Eliphas Levi.
We'll put that in the show notes for you guys listening at home. And
there's a new translation of that, and it's on Audible, and it's very, 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 very good. And I strongly recommend it. But start with the Secret Teachings because it'll give you the fundamental mysteries. And you kind of need those. It gives you a lot of the symbols and stuff like that. It gives you the framework. It's like your survey course. Then you do the Golden Bough, and it gives you a lot of the basic technologies and things like that, and like really time-honored traditions. And then when you go through and do Eliphas Levi, which is really sort of what we call the modern Western esoteric tradition, white guy magic. You have all the perspective and all the foundation to bring to it.
Fantastic. Last thing I'm going to ask you. What quote do you find yourself reflecting on lately? Do you have it tattooed on your body? Do you have it like on a sticky note on your desk? You just find yourself kind of pondering.
I have a quote from my own unpublished manuscript tattooed on my body. I kind of have a weird thing about tattoos, and they really have to be pieces of me for me. So the quote is, "He was the stylus, the Tao was a hand, his life was its poetry." That is something I try to reflect on as much as possible.
That's deep. Brother Moses, it's been a pleasure.
Ace, always a pleasure, man. Let's do part 2 sometime.
I don't know how to tell this. You're not getting off that easy. You'll be on for round 2.
Yes.
If nothing else, we got a lot to unpack, man.
I am game, my friend.
It's hard to get through it in just 2 hours. You've been very generous with your time. Thank you very much.
Right on, brother.
We'll talk to you soon.
Be well. Peace.